Hello, everyone, and welcome to the session Multispecies Sites of Engagement 2, which will offer new ways to think about human-animal relations in the Anthropocene while transitioning between land and sea and the city and forming innovative interdisciplinary research. So my name is Ullrich, and I will be the convener of this panel. We have with us today 3 intriguing presentations. We are also having with us today an honorable discussant, Professor Leslie Irvine. And after the discussion, we will move to Q&A. So our first presenter for this panel is Lisa Herrmann-Fertig from Nuremberg University of Music. Lisa, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction. And I will first of all try to share my slides. Just a second.
No problem.
So many thanks, first of all, for the organization of the panel, the kind introduction, and for the opportunity to present some aspects of my current research project in music research. That is my paper on She Who is Wearing Wild Elephants as Earrings, Theyyam of North Kerala in India. By colleagues of various academic disciplines and by activists, to name just 2 groups, we are currently informed that the human use of other than human beings and raw materials that the environment provides to meet our human needs, together with instrumentalization and environmental degradation, are triggering and have to trigger even more continual critical discussions. Along with the ongoing climate crisis, there are discussions why the current human interaction with non-human animals and the environment is detrimental to the health of all living beings, ecosystems, and the planet, and why the Anthropocene should be understood as a permanent state of emergency for other than human beings. In addition, there are reflections on religions and belief systems in general, and how they shape assumptions about and relationships with nature, and how they can help provide motivation and directions regarding new values that can stress individual as well as joint responsibility towards the environment. For religious worldviews and practices, nature is a revealing context for sensitizing people to questions about their role in relation to cross-species life processes and cultural phenomena in particular. This leads to fundamental questions of equality and debates about what arguments exist for including non-human animal voices, as well as the whole soundscape of a particular place, which is closely linked to the relationship of the individual, human or non-human, with their environment and their listening to the environment. The starting point of my contribution is the fact that other than human acoustic dimensions have thus far received little consideration, especially in musicological studies, and the remark that we, human animals, have forgotten how or are just not able to listen consciously and carefully. Conscious listening, perhaps I will soon be using the conceptual pair careful listening, is a theory I'm currently developing that requires an adaptation of its established methodologies. It goes beyond existing conceptualization concepts and theories of listening, especially in relation to musics, and denotes cross-species listening. It represents an attempt to critically revise the anthropocentric prejudice of previous efforts, and in particular of music research. Some initial aspects are described in Lindsay Hamilton's and Nick Taylor's book Ethnography After Humanism, for example. Already existing practices that have to be transcended are, for example, deep listening, coined by Pauline Oliverus, and sound walks, their anthropocentric attachment. That means the human-centered listening to non-human animals and the entire environment. That is to be deconstructed through conscious listening, and the claim contained therein to grant other than human beings, and therefore other than human voices, an equal agent status, especially in the field of what we call or can call music or musics. Conscious or careful listening is of great importance, as many human beings have forgotten or are just not interested in how to listen. especially across species in a more or other than human range of voices. In relation to the tasks of music research, this does not only mean the demand of equality of all voices represented in a soundscape and in music as special cases of so-called organized sound, not humanly organized sound, as the ethnomusicologist John Blacking put it in 1973. It also has to mean the inclusion of all of the acoustic dimensions of the environment and their suffering and change that is or can be made audible. I'm talking about conscious or careful listening with regard to a diversity of voices that makes up the unique soundscape of a place and its heritage, which makes a careful inclusion of the sense of hearing in addition to the sense of vision necessary. Thus, we have to consider in an equal way non-human biological sounds, that is sounds produced by organisms, and that is called biophony. Geophysically produced sounds, that is anorganic environmental sounds such as wind, rain, etc., and that is called geophony, and sounds produced by humans, that is called anthrophony. The task of music researchers should be to overcome the fact that by definition, music is so far seen as a component of the anthrophony sector. Music has, it's actually better to use the plural, so musics have the ability to express and evoke emotions, shape individual and collective identities, transcend cultural differences and social boundaries, and strengthen cohesion as well as understanding. What we need to do is to include other than human beings and ecosystems in these understandings and the goals that we pursue. An important step towards a functioning theory of conscious or careful listening could be the question of empathy, as understood by Eva Meyer. That is the idea that considering so-called others as subjects or agents is intrinsically connected with empathy and being attentive. This is now to be transferred to music research, including Music King, and to be used for it in Christopher Small's understanding of to music, that is to take part in any capacity in a musical performance, whether by performing, by listening, by rehearsing or practicing, by providing material for performance or by dancing. The ideas outlined are more necessary today than ever because musical phenomena exist in contexts in which other than human beings are significant factors, we can say agents, for the production of meaning, musical meaning in particular, and for the production of sounds. Human sounds are connected with other sounds, and human beings with living beings and things of different kinds, as humans live among non-human beings, which help make the world meaningful, which influence human beings and which are influenced by human beings. What we have to learn is considering their mutual relativity as well as responsibility. Working across species in music research would allow approaching and holistic understanding of sound and musics as a meaningful phenomenon, which is considered the task of multi-species ethnomusicology. This idea has now to be looked at and rethought in the context of so-called world belief systems. World religions and belief systems in general each offer a unique pool of moral values, rules, soundscapes, and consequently of agencies that can give human and non-human animals as well as ecosystems a voice. And religion is perceived as partly responsible for environmental, ecological, and climate crises. This leads to the need to reevaluate and reinterpret religious traditions along with their sacred scriptures in and for the 21st century. We will have a closer look at components of rural Hinduism for my case study on Theyyam. That is one of the richest ritual, mythical, and performative traditions of South Indian popular worship, associated especially with its folk and tribal religious aspects. Hinduism is to be understood as a collective term for a pluralistic complex appearance, a variety of religious communities, practices, and beliefs. From this diversity, I chose the case study on Theyyam because it can be considered representative of a number of South Indian rituals and forms of worship that can be located in rural Hinduism. Through various scriptures, which I unfortunately cannot go into more detail today, Hinduism created a system of ethical values and moral guidelines for the potential preservation and the potential protection of the environment. One may ascertain that some Hindus today have started to focus on sacred texts, and many search for answers to the environmental crises in text as well as practice. Sacred animals appear as a divine being in non-human animal form or with non-human characteristics, including their particular sounds in Hinduism. Furthermore, divine beings in non-human animal form are not completely separated from the living species they represent. Gods and goddesses often have close relationships with them as a companion animal, a vehicle, or a mount. In a further step, that means that non-human animals have souls, just as humans for some Hindus. And since many gods and goddesses manifested themselves in natural phenomena, most Hindus receive divinity and therefore agency in various aspects of nature, in mountains, rivers, trees, and the entire universe, which is pre-Vedic in origin. One can find a perfect idea for my reflection in Julius Lübner's book, Hindus, Their Religious Beliefs and Practices, in which he writes about the meaning of karma and rebirth in modern times. I will quote this passage. A number of Hindus attribute a symbolic significance to the belief in karma and rebirth. Thus, they say it may not be literally true that rebirth takes place in order to expend accumulated karma, but this is a potent way of symbolizing the responsibilities that one generation of human beings bears in respect of succeeding generations. Are we not reborn in our children who will have to face the consequences of our physical and social and environmental decisions, the so-called karma we have created, in the lives and world that they inherit from us? End of quote. We can understand this as an imperative to act in a morally appropriate manner for the welfare of all creation, and to think carefully about our multi-species relations. Or as Karan Singh formulates, I quote again, karma gives tremendous responsibility to the individual and places in his own hands the key to his future destiny. Finally, there is the concept of welfare, not of any particular person or group or class, but of all creation. End of quote. Complementing this, we can consider Mahatma Gandhi's rejection of anthropocentrism. Various forms of environmental activism that are existing in the 21st century use religio-cultural concepts as sources of inspiration and guidance. This attitude of closeness, which, citing Gosling's words, encapsulates more than anything else the ecological relationship that once existed between human communities and their surroundings, end of quote, is to be extended not only to non-human animals, but also to plants, as a passage from the Matsya Puranam teaches us regarding trees. Trees are said to offer more than just aesthetic pleasure, fruits and shade, but they are also vital to maintain our ecosystem, our planet, and well-being for various species. North Kerala's many current problems, however, indicate that the existence of the scriptures, etc., does not have to necessarily translate to eco-friendly behavior and to the attitude that it is not only human beings who have to be seen as agents. The resulting tensions and struggles find expression in Theyyam. That is a centuries-old, indispensable part of the beliefs of North Kerala, performed by so-called scheduled castes and tribes of the region. This so-called rituals theater, North Kerala's cultural heritage and sonic signature, emphasizes the interrelatedness of human and non-human animals and their environment, that are indicators of strong interactions between human and other species, as well as specific ecosystems. In the Theyyam context, media of locally worshipped deities, as well as of spirits, heroes, and non-human animals enable a visual and acoustic, easily accessible revelation of the respective deity through transformation. As incarnate deity, the media bestow blessings. The basic intention is to ensure well-being for human as well as non-human animals and agricultural productivity. That means that Theyyam provides a voice for underprivileged beings because of supplying the opportunity to express personal multi-species concern. One can define the roles of sound and musical phenomena within the range of anthrophony, biophony, and geophony as essential and inseparable components of the ritual that are present throughout Theyyam and assuming decisive functions. For the academic consideration, a critical rethinking of existing concepts, and in particular of our concept of music and of our listening habits, is crucial. Furthermore, the investigation of the ritual and its overall cultural context, that means also the consideration of the social and religious structures, is extremely relevant. A Theyyam-specific example that we can assign to the pool of material and activities we call music, and that we can examine in terms of the question of agency of different species, is Theyyam songs. Theyyam songs are descriptive narrative songs performed for worship and attributable to folklore. We can understand them as mirrors of social and cultural life, a catalyst due to their texts. They emphasize humankind's dependence on the physical and social environment and humankind's confrontation with it. A selected Theyyam describes Bhadrakali, a deity worshipped in Hinduism, especially in South India, making various references to non-human animals and to a specific aspect of environmental sound. I quote a last time. She who is wearing wild elephants as earrings, wearing snakes as rings and bangles, holding a handsword, Vattakam and trident, screaming like the sound of the stormy sea, she charges forward to kill the angry Asura. End of quote. I can conclude that the medium gives the so-called scheduled castes and tribes a voice and bridges the divine with the human, the country with the people, the hidden with the present. Furthermore, the costumes and makeup of the media are made from local and regionally available materials. This also applies to the musical instruments. Birdsong marks the sunrise and thus highlights in the ritual, and the rustling of the palm trees in harmony with the metal bracelets of the medium make up the particular ritual sound. The entire realization of the ritual would be impossible without material provided by the environment, without the sounds of the environment, and without the unique pool of traditions, moral as well as ethical values and rules that rural Hinduism provides as well as demands, and that guides human beings in their relationship with non-human animals and the environment. It demonstrates connections between the acoustic environment and cultural as well as religious practice for the particular region. Thank you very much for listening, and thank you, Ullrich, for keeping the time.
Oh, me? It was you keeping the time, and it's great. Thank you very much, Lisa, for an intriguing talk. And now we will move from the multi-species soundscapes on land to the sounds of the sea animals and listen to the paper of Martin Ullrich from Nuremberg University of Music and Jessica Ullrich from the University of Fine Arts. The stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Ullrich, for the kind introduction, and many thanks to all the organizers of this so far wonderful conference. As my co-author Jessica Ullrich is not able to join us today, I will present our approach to theorize and briefly exemplify what we see as the potential entanglements of the blue humanities and human animal studies. I share my presentation, just a second. The term blue humanities has been introduced by Steve Mentz, professor of English at St. John's University in New York City. Mentz aims at a new perspective for the humanities that shifts from land to water, to the sea, to shores and ships. At the same time, he marks a stream of research that connects scholarly work on water and oceans to approaches from geography, economy, ecology, and political theory. The contour of such an interdisciplinary research program within the framework of critical posthumanism becomes visible in publications like Philip Steinberg's The Social Construction of the Ocean from 2001, Mentz At the Bottom of Shakespeare's Ocean from 2009, and his Shipwreck Modernity, 2015. These selected titles hint at a multi-layered and historically far-reaching discourse since the beginning of the 21st century. However, the theoretical fundaments of the blue humanities date back to the middle of the 20th century, and readers of the fundamental texts encounter some of the saints and the demons of Western cultural history. One of the important starting points for the shift of perspective on water and ocean in Western thinking are Rachel Carson's books, Under the Sea Wind from 1941, The Sea Around Us from 1951, and The Edge of the Sea from 1955. The three books have later been combined as Carson's Sea Trilogy. Nowadays, Carson is mainly known for her fourth book, Silent Spring, which hints at the ecological catastrophes that have become manifest since then. However, In retrospect, especially the sea around us turns out to be an important initial impulse for the new approach that around 50 years later should lead to the blue humanities. Concerning the existential situation of humans on the oceans, Carson writes, and then, as never on land, he knows the truth that his world is a water world, a planet dominated by its covering mantle of ocean, in which the continents are but transient intrusions of land above the surface of the all-encircling sea. End of quote. Here and in other writings on the sea, Carson seems to be an early prophet of the existential importance that the oceans have for Gaia as a holistic system, even if the ecological fragility of the oceanic environments was not as recognizable in 1951 as it is today. Overfishing, plastic pollution, coral bleach, the sixth extinction in the maritime habitats, rising sea levels caused by global warming, and other ongoing catastrophes show us how prophetic Carson has already been more than 70 years ago. Meanwhile, St. Rachel, as Margaret Atwood has called her, might be a secular saint of environmental protection movements and of environmental history. However, the genealogy of the blue humanities includes not only the saints of environmental history, but also some more sinister figures. The German philosopher and legal scholar Carl Schmitt, contaminated by National Socialism, published his book Land und Meer, Land and Sea, in 1941, during the Second World War and in the same year as Carson's first trilogy volume, Under the Sea Wind. In Land und Meer, Schmitt uses the dichotomy of earth and water to discuss questions of the people, the nation, and of anthropology in general. How shall we deal with the fact that Schmitt is one of the points of departure for the blue humanities? Maybe it warns us that new perspectives on water and sea could lead to new mythologies and renationalizations. At the same time, and concerning the field of animal philosophy, Jacques Derrida has shown in his The Beast and the Sovereign that critical discourse analysis can make use of Schmitt for contemporary and progressive thinking about animal theory. So what is new about the blue humanities of the early 21st century? Following Menz, the blue humanities decenter the humanities by cutting the ground under their feet and reconstituting them in the fluidity of the oceanic element. In Menz's own words, blue humanities names an offshore trajectory that places cultural history in an oceanic rather than terrestrial context. Recognizing, in the words of science fiction writer Arthur C. Clarke and numerous marine biologists, that the name of this planet should be ocean, not Earth, blue humanities scholarship uses the alienating pressure of the deep ocean to estrange familiar stories and rewrite familiar narratives. Against discourses that situate human cultures in pastoral fields, enclosed gardens, or teeming cities, the blue humanities post the sailor and the swimmer as representative figures, each differently threatened by and attuned to an inhospitable fluid environment. End of quote. For a critical post-humanist understanding of the blue humanities, it is important to note that the two figures mentioned by Menz, the swimmer and the sailor, are understood as vulnerable and being at the ocean's mercy. This approach is far away from transhumanist fantasies of human omnipotence. In his book Ocean, Menz proposes to substitute discursive keywords by more fluid and less earthbound terms. Field becomes current, state changes to ship, and landscape becomes seascape. While Menz himself is criticizing the latter wording, and I quote again, this shift seems simple enough as part of the offshore trajectory. But is the scape still a problem? Is our language too visual? Underwater creatures seldom rely very much on sight. End of quote. And this is a good opportunity for us to add the point of view of human animal studies. When it comes to sound and music, human animal studies focus on phenomena as animal music, animal soundscapes, and interspecies music. This is a strategy to question the dichotomy of nature and culture and the anthropological difference in the realm of organized sound. Consequently, when we engage with the sound production of water animals, with soundscapes on and underwater, and when we critically analyze discourses on water and the sea in human musics, literatures, and visual arts, we enter an overlapping area between blue humanities and human animal studies. Today, we take our few examples for these intersections and transdisciplinary contact zones from the cultural history of whale song. Anecdotal evidence on the songs of whales derives from the era of whaling with sailing ships. Herbert Ullrich, in his 1889 book Arctic, Alaska, and Siberia, or 8 Months with the Arctic Whaleman, describes such anecdotal information. And I quote, "The captains would endeavor to console one another by telling of hearing a whale sing. I at first took this for a sophomoric joke, slyly intended for me to bite at, so I kept quiet. But one day there was a rehearsing of experiences, and I found that the masters really believed that whales do sing. Captain Kelly was the first to discover the singing, but he was laughed at for it. End of quote. Scientists Roger Payne and Scott McVie, in their article Songs of Humpback Whales, published 1971, describe how the increasing sound emission of motor ships masked the whale songs for the ears of human listeners. But they also document how the underwater listening devices that had been developed during Second World War enabled new forms of access to cetacean vocalizations. The strategic importance of submarines in the beginning Cold War furthered the quick development of better listening technologies for underwater areas. However, an unplanned collateral effect of these developments were new findings about the vocalizations of whales and dolphins and a flourishing of bioacoustic research in the oceans. A first short notice about the musical quality of the sounds and their probable production by whales was published in 1952 in the Journal of the Acoustic Society of America by O.W. Schreiber, an employee of the US Navy's Electronics Laboratory. In the 1960s, scientists analyzed Schreiber's recordings, and especially many recordings Frank Watlington made from another Navy station near Bermuda between 1953 and 1964. Watlington himself and the scientists William Scavell and William Watkins identified the songs with humpback whales. An important extension of the audio material were the bioacoustic recordings made between 1967 and 1971 by Kathy Payne and Roger Payne. While a vinyl record of whale songs published by Scavell and Watkins in 1962 seems only to have reached a small expert community, the long player record Songs of the Humpback Whale, published by Roger Payne in 1970, sold more than 100,000 copies. And this record encompasses recordings produced by Watlington and by Kathy Payne and Roger Payne. It popularized the concepts of whale music and whale culture, and at the same time inspired musicians of different backgrounds to work with whale songs and to integrate whale songs in their own compositions and improvisations. One could ironically say that the whale was for the New Age generation what the nightingale had been for the Romantic era. Actually, singer-songwriter Judy Collins titled her 1970 album Whales and Nightingales. And we will listen to a short excerpt of Judy Collins singing Farewell to Tawathi, a song from the 19th century that deals with whaling from a very anthropocentric perspective. It is an intertextually remarkable combination to underscore this piece with excerpts of the humpback whale recordings. Nearly at the same time, in 1971, and inspired by whale song recordings too, but in another stylistic context, American avant-garde composer George Crumb composed his Vox Balaenae, so the voice of the whale, a trio for amplified flute, cello, and piano. And in jazz, bass player Charlie Hayden published his Song for the Whales in 1979 with his quartet Old and New Dreams. However, whale songs featured not only in music, but also in film. The fourth film in the original Star Trek franchise, Star Trek IV, The Voyage Home from 1986, features humpback whale song as the crucial element for the survival of the human species and for the conservation of the Earth's ecosystem in the 23rd century. The fictitious extinction of humpback whales in the future, a realistic threat in the time of creation of the film as in our present time, leads to the vanishing of their song and therefore to the near annihilation of Earth by an alien space probe that is trying to communicate with the whales. The impact of these very different creative productions on the development of human-whale relationships, and especially on the ban of commercial whaling, should not be underestimated. And at the same time, whale songs are an important point of reference for experiments in the area of interspecies music, the musical collaboration of humans and non-human animals in a live performance situation. Jazz musician Paul Winter reports to have music in the 1970s with whales, mediated by underwater microphones and loudspeakers. And another pioneer of interspecies music, musician and environmental activist Jim Nallman, has used a similar technical setting to realize a duo improvisation with an orca. I'll play you just a short excerpt of that. Sorry to interrupt for time's sake. Music analysis would call the dialogue initiated by Neumann a call and response pattern. And the melodic development of the orchestra vocalizations follows the harmonic principle of Afro-American blues formulas. Here we could rhetorically ask, how blue is the blues in the context of the blue humanities? Experimenters as Winter and Neumann have set examples of interspecies musicking that are today further developed by protagonists as David Rothenberg and Michaela Harrison. The latter's whale whispering project is mentioned by Alexis Pauline Gams in her 2020 book, Undrowned, Black Feminist Lessons from Marine Mammals. Gams contextualizes research on marine mammals with findings from Black feminism and again points out the importance of a deep listening approach. Lisa, you mentioned it already. Gams, how can we listen across species, across extinction, across harm? Listening is not only about the normative ability to hear, it is a transformative and revolutionary resource that requires quieting down and tuning in, end of quote. Her poetic and at the same time discursive approach to interspecies communication with marine mammals is a pristine contemporary example for the intersectional potential of bringing together human animal studies and the blue humanities. To wrap it up, human animal studies and the blue humanities, understood as interdisciplinary areas of critical post-humanist theory, pose challenges to established disciplines like musicology, history of art, film studies, and literary studies. Our impression is that the blue humanities so far have sometimes tended to diminish, in some cases even overlook, the role of non-human animals in this critical process of deconstructing anthropocentrism. On the other hand, human animal studies up to now may have often dealt with the pastoral concept of a stable and earthbound environment that the blue humanities have set out to deterritorialize. Both areas can contribute to their mutual development and entanglement, at the same time leading to a better understanding of what Rosi Braidotti has called media-nature cultures, thus synthesizing Donna Haraway's concept of nature cultures and Jussi Parikka's idea of media natures. Thank you for listening, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Martin. That was fascinating indeed. Nicola, are you here? Great. Just unmute.
Yes, I'm here.
So we will shift now from the sea to the urban scape, and our last presenter will be Nicola Zengiaro from the University of Bologna. The stage is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm just sharing my... Are you see everything? Do you see everything? Okay. Okay, so thank you very much. I'm just talking about semiotics today. In the field of urban semiotics, we can think about the city. When we think about the city, the question is not so much what a city is, but who makes the city. Because the object city is an object to be constructed. This object is precisely made up of those who inhabit. For example, the subjects who make up this urban space. In the same way, if it makes sense to ask who make the city, when we think about a park, it makes sense to ask who makes the park. When we ask who makes the park, we have to take into account new actors who bring new meanings to the fore. These are meanings that modify the urban environment, not only in the green area, but also in the city's policies and social relations. The codes of the city are modified by other species. The park as an actor capable of action programs, of producing meaning, proposal of values, alteration of people and animals, plants and things. The park investigated in its explosion of meanings. In this sense, biosemiotics is an interdisciplinary research program that investigates the myriad forms of communication and signification found in and among living systems. Ecosymbiotics is a branch of biosemiotics and is concerned with the relationship that exists between organism and the environment, nature and culture. These relationships are essentially semiotics processes necessary for any form of life to survive in each environment. The organism from the semiotic processes is therefore able to adapt and modifying its environment. Without semiosis, life would not be able to understand the environment and adapt effectively. In other words, without semiosis, life will perish because it will be inadequate to the context in which it's found. For ecosemiotics, the landscape is interpreted as a semiotics interface between the resources that the surrounding offer and the organism with its species qualifies. When we think of the city, we cannot see it as a natural environment. In fact, for most thinkers, the city is an artificial place. However, the city is but a large ecological niche based on cultural and social rules. In other words, it is a mixture of nature and culture. Non-human animals living in the cities themselves affirm this perspective. Certain birds have learned to make nets out of cigarettes, but to drive away parasites. Others steal sugar packets from the bars to feed their young. Still others wait for nightfall to eat from inner city rubbish. But it is not just a cultural dynamic in the sense that animals respect certain rhythm and space in the city. There are animal species that have adapted to human waste and others that have undergone speciation. In fact, species of animals have emerged that exist only in the city and do not exist outside it. The evolution of the city has modified the evolution of certain species, just as so-called natural environments do. In this sense, what we can observe in the macro expansion of the cities is that the urban space does not take away habit from fauna and flora, but modifies it. In other words, the city has been seen to influence evolution. The cohabitation of many animals and plant species had led to an adaptation of anthropophilic life forms. In this sense, it is not possible to separate the city from the rest of the natural environments, just as it is not possible to separate nature from culture. In fact, cities are real habitats with the same dynamics as an ecosystem considered natural. The division between nature and culture, as well as the division between natural and artificial, does not exist in the ecological representation of the biosphere. It is an ideology to consider the city as something external to wild and uncontaminated nature. There is no such nature except in the human imagination. Indeed, taking an ecological look at the entire animal world, one must observe that humans and non-humans alike are ultimately ecosystem engineering. There is a need to deconstruct an ideology about the nature-culture divide and re-establish a view of human cities as a totally natural phenomenon, speaking of the urban ecosystems. However, even if we believe that cities are part of a process of building an ecological niche for human animal that harbors non-human anthropophilic, we must still conform to the exponential devastation and pollution of the elements that sustain the biosphere. Indeed, there are disparate narratives about the end of the world caused by the human ecological footprint. These post-apocalyptic narratives, however, fail to focus on the real processes that is taking place in the Anthropocene. What may be coming to an end is the life on the planet of multiple species, including our own. But despite the reflections that equate the end of our species with the end of the world, These are ideological narratives that bring us back to the center of an ecological dynamic. Beyond the devastation, there will always exist life form that will subsist despite the catastrophe we are experiencing. Bacteria, plants, small animals will survive and thrive beyond an ideological end of the world. What will happen is the end of the human world, not the world in general. However, there is an inherent vital resilience that intersects nature and cultural cities. The notion of nature-cultural indicates a synthesis of nature and culture that recognize their inseparability in ecological relationship that are both biophysical and social. Introduced by feminist philosopher Donna Haraway to describe intertwined multi-species histories, the term illuminates new ways of thinking about the agency and power, difference and sociality of life forms. The term has no single definition. Rather, it represents a vibrant spectrum of transdisciplinary approaches that are unified by a common argument. Participating in worlds that are more than human requires changing the method of study. In the other word, dissolving the boundary between nature and culture means radically remixing the art, humanities, social science, and natural science. In this multidisciplinary context, we use semiotics to account for a reinterpretation of relational meanings between human and non-human within cities as a complex ecosystems. Creating bonds of the making or of kinship, Donna Haraway's making kin, lead us to rethink the cities from a post-human perspective. The post-human city is an hybrid space in which one's present does not wait on the surrounding space. It is a hybridization and crossbreeding of urban structure, treating each structure as a trajectory of coexistence. It is a practice of living radically different from how we have thought about it until now, based on welcoming, inclusiveness, and multiplicity. In the centripetal movement offered by urbanism beyond the human, a shift of the signifier stands out. This allows us to reconsider the coexistence of life without any hierarchical relationship. Is there such a radical form of coexistence? Which model should we take inspiration from to contemplate a complete coexistence among life forms? However, one must first ask oneself, how is it possible to coexist with other life forms? Forms that are radically different from our own many times. The question belongs to the field of ethology, but also to that of semiotics. Indeed, ecosymbiotics seeks to investigate the signs that are meaningful to the species in a given environment. It is about trying to understand what can be meaningful in cities for non-humans, and from this to give space to these signs. We can offer two readings that related to understanding the needs of other species. The first seeks to identify metamorphic zone, as Latour would say, places where we can hybridize and expand them. If we find places where humans and animals can coexist, from parks to square without fountains, from school's garden to green crossing on motorways, we build more of them. In this way, we can help non-human life to proliferate in certain areas. Also, by designing more hybridization zones, humans learn a new way of being in the world, definitely a more sustainable way. The other way is to let life live. This may sound like a poetic proposition, and perhaps it is, but what is mean is that there are abandoned spaces, places where life, in spite of everything, has recovered. Here, those abandoned spaces must be left to non-human life without interfering. Semiotics can reinterpret the relationship we have with other living beings in different ecological systems, such as the city, the forest, the sea, but also everything that can be interpreted as an ecological text: highways, bridges, gardens, landfills. We propose below a further proposal that follows the attempt to educate individuals in the recognition and understanding of other living beings. The aim is to form a co-species landscape. The co in co-species stands for coexistent species, but also a cohabit species understood as a peaceful coexistence, a mutual adaptation and forbearance. Co understood as a prefix means all or together, implying a simultaneous existence. It is a mode of coexistence from an understanding of other species. It concerns respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity, as well as acceptances of the existence of the other. It is the activity by which it is possible to design a landscape that is hospitable to the multiple forms of life that emerge with their meanings. Co-species landscape is established through a life from ready for coexistence on a planet that is in ruins. It is a design of an interspecific collaboration to overcome this historical moment called Anthropocene. In this way, we should begin to design a co-species landscape, integrating to the cohabit of cities. As is now being pointed out, there is a growing need to learn to cohabit in the Anthropocene and to design a post-Anthropocene that reintegrates other life forms as an active part in human existence in the biosphere. A post-Anthropocene that provides for our survival will necessarily be a space of coexistence and re-engagement with other species. So, in conclusion, I will propose in this multidisciplinary context a semiotic lecture to account for our interpretation of the relation meaning between human and non-human within cities as a complex system. We propose the following theoretical scenarios to reinterpret coexistence. The first of all, making community to build nature-cultural cities. First proposal is recasting these spaces abandoned by humans that become the refuge for many animal and plant species. The reference is the third landscape proposed by Gilles Clement, in which places abandoned by men, places therefore invisible to the human eye, can generate a refuge. These are parks, natural reserves, but also uninhabited areas, roadside, weeds, brambles, brushwood, large and abandoned industrial areas. These are places where human presence has given way to the birth of ecological change. The human-nature relationship reveals in this context that it can be the human that is removed from a completely non-human living space. It is a culturally based urban regeneration for areas of margin. Place that also, thanks to human intervention, could host more life. It is a collaborative approach to living a space completely absent of humans. It is an activity by subtraction, a community based on the resid, derived from living space to the set of biological beings that make up the territory. A landscape that expresses neither power nor submission to power. Creating bonds or the making of kinship leads us to rethink the city from a post-human perspective. The post-human city is a hybrid space in which one's presence does not wait in the surrounding space. And another proposal is rethinking the.
Nicola, can you?
Yes, I'm at the finish. Thanks.
Great, thank you.
So at the final, educating a natural gaming semiotics in which people are educated to rediscover urban nature through play. A practical example is the City Nature Challenge that has taken off in the United States as an annual challenge in which citizens strive for a week to document local biodiversity as a challenge. In this example, for conclusion, the culture begins to change radically from a naive conception of ecology to a new model and project of life. In all cases, sustainability is sought on ecological, social, spiritual, and economic level. And thank you very much for your listening. And sorry.
Thank you very much. Sorry for disturbing you as well. Now we are delighted to have with us sociologist Professor Leslie Irvine from University of Colorado, Boulder. You may please start.
Wow, what incredible work. I've been thinking about these papers for several days now, and I've been especially thinking about them because I'm coming to you from the leafy green mountains of northern Colorado, but I was at the end of last week in Chicago. So very different settings with regard to the nature culture divide and the soundscapes that surrounded me. And so as I was thinking about these papers, I thought I would talk about areas in which they converge, and then I'll discuss each paper a little bit individually, and I'll pose a question for each of you for potential discussion or not, just to open a door. And you don't have to answer it when I pose it, but after I finish, you can toss these ideas around so you can have some time to make a few notes and think about it if you like. So first of all, I appreciate the way these papers all address areas in which the agenda, if you will, has long revolved around the exclusion of animals and focused on the practices, the undertakings of human beings. So in Lisa's paper, in religion, I'll rely on my sociological great-great-grandfather, Emil Durkheim, and talk about his perspectives on religion, how humans have used religion to explain their predicament. But religion, in that perspective, was a worship of society, which was a human accomplishment. And when people thought they were worshiping God, Durkheim says they're actually worshiping society, which means we're actually worshiping ourselves, right? Durkheim's perspective is that religion involves kind of a sleight of hand, kind of a deception. In terms of music, how music has revolved around the exclusion of animals, even though in some cases it has sought to duplicate the sounds that animals such as birds make. And so we've seen a long history in which anthropogenic sound has dominated. And even the sound that was as far away from animal sound as possible. And as we heard, those who claim to have heard whale songs were mocked and laughed at. And in the research on cities, this is a zone in which exists for human activity. Human activity is the organizing principle, and urbanization is, in a primary sense, a process of constantly pushing other life forms out, either through the use of space, or even through legislating animals out of cities. So I see these as touching on these areas in which the focus has been the exclusion of animals, and these wonderful, original, ambitious works have suggested ways that we might bring animals back in. In addition, all the papers give us new concepts, new theoretical perspectives with which to think. Whether we have biosemiotics or ecosymbiotics, these are ways of stretching the existing paradigms. We have conscious listening and multi-species musicology, and the notion of blue humanities and the media, nature, culture perspective that expands beyond Haraway's wonderfully useful nature cultures perspective. So in Lisa's ambitious, wonderful paper, we're looking at this ancient religion and its continued practice. We're looking at the interrelatedness of human and animal nature and the environment, where the religious ritual depends on the environment and the animals within it, including its sounds. And I wondered, you showed a slide, Lisa, with an elephant wearing a headdress. And what struck me when I was looking at this slide is the question of how to reconcile reverence for other species with the chains around the elephant's ankles. And even in the title of the paper, she who's wearing wild elephants as earrings and snakes as bangles, there's a reverence for animals, but also permission to use animals. And in one of your slides you talked about the problems existing in the region of North Kerala. You said this reverence doesn't necessarily translate into solving the ecological dilemmas. So I wondered if you would be interested in talking a bit further later on about reconciling the deep reverence you saw for other species with the exploitation of them. Martin, the wonderful term I learned, the blue humanities, and bringing that together with human animal studies. I'm fascinated by the cultural history of whale songs. I remember as a child first hearing the songs of the humpback whale, and both through the Judy Collins album and the Paul Winter, yes, thank you, both through the Paul Winter music. And I was struck not too long ago by an encounter with the reversal. In my class on animals and society, which enrolls several hundred students, this year I showed the film Sonic Sea from 2016 about the devastating consequences of anthropogenic noise for whales and other marine life. And so we hear these beautiful songs of the humpback whales and we appreciate them, but then to see what our efforts have done to their environment. And some of the students said it was the most powerful thing that they took away from my class. And they said things like, I will never tap on the glass of an aquarium again. So this notion of interspecies music and the history of it, I loved the jam session with the guitar. I thought that was absolutely wonderful. And I enjoyed this cultural history. And I wondered if, I know you acknowledge that consideration for whales was generated in large part by the commercial introduction of the songs of the humpback whales. As you say, there are probably very few people who heard the original recordings, who had access to them even. But who, and you say, you know, once this sound became commercially available, people began considering whales as the majestic beings deserving of respect that they are, rather than something for strictly human use. But I wonder if you could take that a step further and talk about who benefits from interspecies music. If we know that animals have benefited from our knowledge of their music, they most likely don't benefit one whit from our music, but talk a little bit about who benefits from interspecies music. Nicola, who makes the park? What a wonderful way to begin the paper. I'm familiar with the work of Jennifer Walsh, the geographer who uses the term zoopolis, not in the political sense that Will Kymlicka has used it, but to talk about cities and the ways we can make them more friendly, more accommodating, more welcoming to the animals who find their way in, regardless of the things we do to exclude them. And like you, Walsh's work is not focused on, you know, we're not going to make the city a living zoo, but there are many, many synanthropic species such as pigeons and, hawks are doing very well in New York City, roosting on buildings, and coyotes have found their way into parks. There are, of course, some species who are doing lots of damage in places like wild pigs, I know, are making quite a mess in cities like Berlin and other places. But these co-species landscapes are, in your paper, getting the recognition that they deserve. We have to figure out how to balance space and need. Animals don't recognize boundaries, whether we're talking about, national parks where there's open space and there's a boundary there, or whether we're talking about a city park like the slide that you showed. They're not going to recognize, well, this tree is okay for me to nest in, but not this tree that's over on the sidewalk. And I was reminded about some of the images I saw during the COVID shutdown, when human activity decreased dramatically, and we saw some animals roaming in cities freely that, now that they had the space and now that they weren't bothered by us humans, they moved around quite a bit. At the end of your paper, you talk about, let's see, how do you put it exactly? The two approaches. One is to identify these metamorphic zones where we can let other than human life proliferate, whether it's through these wildlife overpasses or through green spaces or whatever intentionally created. On the other hand, we can have these spaces where we, quote unquote, let life live in these deserted areas. We humans have basically, let's face it, we've basically ruined them. We've used them and abandoned them. How do we balance space and need, and who gets to say what gets turned into this? Let's take this image of the apartment building you showed with the balconies overflowing with plants. I love the idea of it. I can see people saying, yes, but there are people sleeping on the streets, in the gutters, and so on. So the question of how to balance space and need is one I'd really like to hear you talk about. But overall, these papers have really had an impact on me in terms of landscapes and soundscapes. And I want to commend all three of you for this original work that you're doing in your various areas. And you've brought new terminology into my vocabulary and opened up my thinking in new ways that I very much appreciate. So, you know, I know some things this week that I didn't know last week. And I can't always say that when I come to a conference. So I very much appreciate it. And I'm going to mute myself now, and perhaps we could just go in the order in which you spoke, and you could maybe discuss the questions or discuss whatever else you want to talk about. So thank you, all three of you.
Thank you very much. That was inspiring, and I share with you the feelings of new awareness. Lisa, would you like to comment?
Yeah, thank you very much, Leslie, for the comment and the question. I'm very happy that you realized the chain, because I thought a long time if I should print that picture or not. That was discussed several times in my classes I teach and so on. And I think it's necessary, because what we see is an animal with some kind of agency in this temple ritual we saw. But what I wanted to start is that we have to listen carefully and see or watch carefully. And that is what was started by your comment. And I'm sure that several people also realized what is going on in these contexts. This can happen, it does not happen. And that is the passage, what I said, that the scriptures have not necessarily translated to non-human animal, eco-friendly behavior, but they can. And they are companion animals of the deities. With the headgear we saw, there was another kind of action between human, non-human, deity, non-human animal, and so on. But we have to look at, and carefully have to look at, details, that it's some kind of agency. And I think what we can learn is by careful listening, especially in musics, in this ritual context, that there are so many voices, especially of non-human kind, we can focus on. And we can find out what ways we have to listen in a different way, in a multi-species way. And this happens, first of all, by noticing these details, oftentimes by seeing, by recognizing them by the eyes. But what we have to learn is that we have to recognize that we are able to recognize it also by using our ears in the soundscape context, or in this special case, we call musics, whatever this is, in the different definitions, understandings of musics we have worldwide.
Thank you, Lisa. Martin?
Thank you, Leslie, for your comment and for this excellent question, who benefits from interspecies music? And I would just like to briefly hint at the sample of examples we showed today is on the light end of the practices of interspecies music. There is this dark end as well, when music is used in a very vertical hierarchy to oppress non-human animals, or to impose human dominion on them. So in the examples of today, the animals were free to join in the musical collaboration or just to leave. So it's one of the extreme situations in a very gradual historical setting. I think there are two potential benefits, and they are on quite different levels. One is that some of the interspecies musicians see their musical practice as a kind of activism, as well as the publication of the Songs of the Humpback Whale was a kind of an act of activism. And Jim Neumann, for example, is maybe even more an environmental activist than he is an interspecies musician. So non-human animals can benefit from this kind of artivism. And then there is this other, I think, very interesting question. I can only answer with another question now, because there is a lack of research, especially of scientific research, on the aesthetic experiences of animal musicians. So there's a lot of functional interpretation in the sciences and in bioacoustics, but if you want to ask scientists whether birds or whales or what species ever enjoy their songs, you can only ask in the coffee breaks we don't have at this Zoom conference. And even then they will look over the shoulder whether other scientists are listening. And then they will tell you, yeah, there was this moment when I was in the field and obviously the bird enjoyed itself and there was no, but there is a lack of scientific research on that. And so I, as a music researcher and as someone from the cultural studies field, can only speculate. But I think if animals enjoy themselves in musicking, and if they enjoy to listen to other music cultures, as we have in many species of whales, that they adopt the songs of a neighboring group or of another individual, and they are curious and interested in what we would call like progressive development of their music, then they can be curious in human music as well, I think, and they can have like aesthetic pleasure or aesthetic experiences in interchanging with humans, as we do in the interspecies musicking with them.
Thank you, Martin. Nicola?
Thank you for the question. In Italy, during the lockdown, we had an invasion of wild boars, and people were surprised, but they have always been there. I mean, we just don't see them. And opening up space to other life forms means, for me, opening it up to all those lives that are discriminated. I mean, we think for the poor, for animals, immigrants, and so on. And for me, for just my looking, educating for the diversity means creating new spaces for the dialogue. I see that architects are having a new look at these issues. And think, for example, of Stefano Boeri's Vertical Forest in Milan. One step at a time, we will understand the need to bring non-humans back to the city. Alternatively, we will become extinct. And this is my...
Great. I'm sorry, but unfortunately our time is up, but you can write emails to the participants because their email addresses are in the abstract book. And we thank you very much for participating, and especially you, Professor Irvine, for your fascinating comments, and you really provoked many ways of thinking about those inspiring lectures by themselves. And I understand what you mean by now I notice sounds, and as an anthropologist I was more looking, and now I'm starting to listen, and you really helped me to notice it. So we will meet here again at 8:45 with the session The Wild and the Domesticated. Stay tuned. Thank you very much.